Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bang on Sales Show. I'm your host, Mark Bangs. And to set the scene for today's guest, I wanted to read just a little snippet from his bio on his LinkedIn profile. So he says, B2B sales is morally bankrupt. 40% of buyers believe the sales professional is untrustworthy, and 25% of buyers believe that our profession is, quote, morally and ethically challenged. Ouch, he says. Sales professionals must raise their standards now more than ever. And my guest is on a mission to help companies raise their sales standards and advance the way they do business with their clients. Here, I like that. One bit I really like that we're going to get into shortly is most leaders have the wrong idea about sales and end up losing hundreds of thousands. They manage sales as if they are still in the 90s, and then they're confused why buyers don't respond favorably. I could go on, but I'll let you speak for yourself. Today's guest is Moeed Amin. How are you doing, Moeed?
Yeah, very well, Mark, and thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it is coming on. As a way of getting started, you maybe want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, professional stuff. Yeah, I've been in sales for 20 years now, and typically started out in very kind of boiler room style sales. Very quickly moved into the more complex sales kind of solutions and processes, working for various companies, including companies like CEB and Gartner and others. Moved up to kind of the career. Well, took a particular career path into management. It's not necessarily moving up; it's just a different career path. And frankly, enjoyed it, but got really tired of seeing the misconception of how how fit for purpose sales is conducted, and the perception around that, both from the sales profession itself, but also from the business leaders and even the VCs and investors of this world. So I got really tired of seeing that, and got really tired of seeing salespeople, particularly those that are starting out in their career, being left in the wayside and being taught things that, quite frankly, are just nonsensical. I broke away, and in 2019 started the company Proverbial Door. And as you said, we have a mission, and the mission is quite straightforward but not simple, and that is to elevate the way that sales is both perceived and conducted, both within the sales profession and outside. To help salespeople understand the buyer's perspective, because there's, compared to all the sales training and principles and kind of theory, or not theory, but kind of the research out there, very small part of that is from the buyer's perspective, and yet they're the people that are engaging with us and giving us the money. So why is that? So that's a big part of what we do. And I'm about to speak to my 428th buyer in the interview process next week. And we've been doing that across 10 different industries, 9 functional areas, and 3 seniority levels. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's really what we're about. And coming from a neuroscience background, I graduated in neuroscience, and I also have a qualification in marketing, but heavily involved in that. The proposition that I have and the approach that I take is very unique, and kind of blending all 4 of those things together, actually. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
That's great. Yeah, no, cheers for that. Given that you've spoken to so many buyers, I may be putting you on the spot here, but what would you say are the biggest, or maybe the most common or the biggest takeaways from those? I guess in terms of how things are typically done sales-wise, and maybe versus how they should be done.
Yeah, good question. The first thing that is the biggest source of frustration for buyers is how selfish and self-centered salespeople are. The approach from the cold email or the cold call, even the marketing in a lot of ways, is so self-centered. And this is why I talk about still stuck in the 90s, because back in the 90s, when you think about the information accessibility of humans in general, there were very few points of what I call nodes of knowledge, right? These are sources of information and knowledge. The internet wasn't around. It'd typically be books. It would be your peer networks, especially. It were very finite sources of information. And because of that, the dynamic between the sales and the buyer was very, very different. The salespeople and the vendors that they represented were a very large source of information for the buyers. Nowadays, that's not the case. But back then in the 90s, we could afford to talk about features and benefits, right? We moved on to benefits quite quickly, but we can afford to do so because we were one major channel of that information. Now that's not the case. And we can't be so self-centered anymore because the buyer is far more educated, far more knowledgeable, far more exposed to more information. So sellers being very self-centered is one of the biggest gripes for buyers because they're not interested, quite frankly. And psychologically, there's a term called a theory called psychological egoism. And basically that theory states that every action or decision that we take is in our own self-interest. So buyers are not interested in us as sellers or what we have to offer. They're really only interested in themselves. And it's only when they see alignment between what you do and their interests, that's when they will entertain a discussion. So salespeople, their cold emails and cold calls and messages are just so painfully self-centered. Very little in general is about the buyer and their circumstance and their situation. And yet, that is one of the most powerful ways to create rapport with someone. It's when you acknowledge and understand that person's position and you're willing to talk about that with them before talking about yourself. So that's one of the biggest gripes. An offshoot of that is the continuous aggressive nature of sales approaches. And salespeople still get offended when a buyer doesn't respond to them, or a buyer doesn't talk or go down the track that the salesperson wants to. I mean, how selfish is that? A buyer owes you nothing, right? If anything, you're the one that's trying to get their attention, get their interest, desire, action, and receive their money in exchange for the value that you give them. So actually, you're the one that should do all the work. You're the one that should go over the line to meet them where they are, not them. So they owe you nothing. And salespeople still seem to have this kind of egotistical, self-centered expectation that why isn't a buyer responding to my email, or it's discourteous that they're not doing so. But you're one of hundreds.
Yeah.
So
what do you think of the LinkedIn post moaning about being ghosted, stood up on meetings? I kind of think maybe there's a reason that's happening.
Well, I try to avoid absolutes because the world doesn't work like that. So I'm never going to say never. There are instances where buyers are genuinely discourteous towards salespeople. I've experienced it many times. That does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't. But you've also got to face the reality that the other side of that is, you haven't done your job right? You haven't done it well. And buyers, just like you're constantly prioritizing where you're placing your time and attention. And fair enough, if they've agreed to a meeting with you and they don't turn up to that meeting, okay, that's something else, right? And we still have to be understandable because and this is where emotional intelligence comes in. You just don't know what's happened. There might have been a tragedy, right? Their CEO might have suddenly called them and they have no time in which to respond to you, right? I mean, there are circumstances that sometimes are out of the buyer's control. So we have to be a bit more understanding. So in that instance, I get it, but you also need to have just a little bit of understanding. But ghosting on, where they say, hey, we're interested, let me come back to you on a time that we can arrange to talk, and they don't come back to you, you can't take it personally. Because there's a saying that you have in NLP and kind of influencing, you cannot judge and influence at the same time. Biologically, you just can't do that. So put aside your judgments and seek to understand first. Why is that person ghosting? What could be going on in their world? How can I empathize and understand, and therefore change my dialogue, change my approach to actually support them as opposed to judging them? So yeah, I don't know if that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's my perspective.
That's brilliant. No, it's brilliant. I always say to try to take ownership, whatever happens, whatever the outcome, have personal responsibility. If even if you got ghosted or someone clearly messed you around, is there something that you did or didn't do or didn't say at some point earlier in the process? Maybe you didn't build that rapport properly or that credibility. You didn't establish yourself as a peer, and so there was just that slight disconnect in terms of the respect, or something like that you can learn from. But again, as you say, it comes down to emotional intelligence and having that self-awareness. So no, brilliant.
Yeah. I really like that, Mark. You're spot on. I think it's this moving away from victim mentality, right, and victim mindset to take ownership, right? There are forces that will be outside your control, but I would challenge anyone that tries to tell me that your choices are not a source of power, right? You can choose to either take the position of a victim, or to say that you're being ghosted and it's unfair, or you can choose to take control of both your mindset and the situation and ask yourself, what could I have done better? Why has this person disappeared? Right? And what next steps should I take? So I love what you just said about taking ownership. And, there are tons of books out there. I think there was one called Extreme Ownership, definitely something that I would recommend people read. But yeah, I totally agree with you. And I like the way you described this.
Yeah, no, good. So to pull it back around to talking about the customer, because that's what we're all about, right? So you used the phrase customer-centric, customer centricity, which I love. I'm the same, or buyer centricity. You've alluded to some of this already, but could you maybe talk a bit about, what does that mean to you? Where do you see businesses going wrong? Is there a clear path for improving that?
Yeah, and to be honest, I actually should change that term, because what I really want to say is buyer obsession, customer obsession.
Yeah.
I heard this from a gentleman called Keith Cunningham, and he says that the successful businesses, particularly successful business leaders, are not product obsessed. They're kind of buyer obsessed, right? And what I mean by that for sales is, firstly, stepping into the world of the buyer. I've asked hundreds of salespeople this one simple question, and probably only a handful, I could probably count on one hand, those that were able to answer this question confidently and accurately. And the question is this:
you're not going to ask me, are you?
No, I'm not going to ask you that. No. But it's definitely something that if you can't answer confidently and accurately, then you're missing a really big point here. And the question was this: what are the top 3 to 5 MBOs that your buyers are responsible for, or how your buyers are measured? So MBOs are management by objectives. This is not KPIs. These are the 3 to 5 things that are on their performance reviews, and they are being judged by whether they've done a good job every year, right? It determines their career progression. It determines their bonus and their income. It determines the things that are most important to most people in their career, right? Now, if you don't know what those 3 to 5 things are, how could you possibly start aligning your solution to what's really going to matter to them? Because if you can't show what you're offering is actually going to help them get promoted, help them achieve their performance levels, help them look good in front of their managers and their senior leaders, then you're missing a massive trick here. So that's a very basic and yet very powerful form of buyer obsession, which is, how is my buyer being gold and being bonused and rewarded? What are the things that that their leaders are looking to in order to say, hey, you know what? You have done a good job, right? So that's the first thing. And buyer obsession is an offshoot of that. It's, can I describe a day in the life, a week in a life, month in a life, quarter in a life of my typical buyer? And can I describe it in such detail that the buyer would be forgiven for thinking that I've done their job before. Because if you can understand that to that level of detail, A, you're living their world, and B, you are able to actually look at what they're doing in terms of big picture, right? You're not just talking about your solution and what it does in the moment. You're talking about your solution and what it does in the context of their working life.
Yeah.
And being able to do that also helps you identify trigger points for when they might think about either your solution or a situation that your solution can get involved with. Because your solution, I mean, even just going to third parties is just one option, right? There are several other options that a buyer can take without having to go through a third party. The biggest ones being do it ourselves or just not doing it at all and continuing as is. So if you don't understand their world, you cannot understand the value of what you bring. You cannot understand the context of the value of what you bring. And here's the important part. You won't be able to observe and notice when things change in their world, which can have a dramatic impact on the viability and value of your solution, because your solution could become redundant.
Yeah.
So if you don't, so this is about being more buyer obsessed as opposed to product obsessed or solution obsessed or benefits obsessed or feature obsessed or even sales obsessed. This is about being obsessed about my buyers so that I know what I'm offering them. I know the value, I know the context. I also can build rapport with them. Again, we're going back to psychological egoism here.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean, this is a big topic and I'm trying to distill it down into its salient points, but that's what I mean by being buyer obsessed. Precious few salespeople are, in my opinion. Actually, what's even worse is precious few business leaders are. They're really obsessed about what their mission is, and their product and solution, and their funding and making their millions or billions and getting an exit. Precious few are obsessed about the buyers. They claim to be, but I sent out a post recently, which was, don't tell me, show me, right? And most business leaders talk the talk, but they very few walk the walk and truly actually act on those principles.
Glad you mentioned leadership there, because I was going to ask you, whose responsibility is this? Because yes, the individual sales contributors should take, as we alluded to, ownership of this stuff, but I feel like this is more a piece that comes before that, when understanding like your ideal customer profile, and that obviously then informs your broader go-to-market strategy, the messaging, the channels that you're getting people through, and so on. So, yeah, could you speak about that? Who should be doing this, figuring this stuff out?
I mean, it's an interesting question, Mark, because there are responsibilities on both sides, right? But I would say for sure the leaders, I think it's everyone's responsibility, but the leaders of the business have the power to shape that responsibility into actionable situations. And I don't just mean sales leaders or the CEO or the founder of the company. I mean all the senior leaders from the cross-functional perspective.
Yes.
So product people should be buyer obsessed. HR should also be buyer obsessed, right? And their buyers, quote, buyers, are the customers and also the people in the business, the colleagues, the employees, right? They're ultimately their buyers. But you can't hire people if you don't understand the traits of your buyers, because what are you then hiring for? Are you hiring people that are going to be incongruent with your buyers, not going to understand your buyers? So whatever function you're in, even finance, you've got to know your buyers, and it's the job of the leadership team to champion that perspective, to champion the buyer's position in the business and champion the understanding of that. It's not just sales and marketing. However, sales, and to an extent marketing, sales are in the most privileged position to help the business understand the buyers as clearly as possible. And that's why I say it's both sides. There is also the responsibility of salespeople. Now, again, leaders need to facilitate that, but salespeople are ultimately the closest to the buyers in the buying community. They're at the sharp end of where your company meets the market. So you're in a privileged position to both ask the right questions, gather the information and intelligence, and kind of communicate those insights and those findings into the business so that everyone benefits from that knowledge as well. So it is both sides, but certainly, as you alluded, leadership have a responsibility to champion and ensure that there is that culture of understanding the buyer and that perspective. And salespeople, as well as marketing, are also in a privileged position just because of the proximity of their connection with the buyers to gather that information, have the interest to ask questions about them, right? Store that information somewhere or capture that information and then disseminate that information throughout the business. So I'd like to say it's just one group of people, but it isn't. It's both sides, but both sides have a responsibility and both sides have ways in which they can act on that responsibility.
So what I'm hearing is we need to be hiring for more than just hunter mentality in sales, and there's a bit more to it than that. Yeah.
Those that understand the buyers are the ones that actually,
that's great.
Funnily enough, have great relationships with them.
Yeah. You mentioned culture, which is really interesting because I've got this. I've seen sort of over the years in certain businesses I've worked in that it tends to be the most outspoken or the loudest people that get promoted particularly into sales leadership positions. And I wonder if this stems from this old school perception of sales, that it's all about having the gift of the gab, being a people person, having that slight bit of aggression or pushiness about you. And I think that talking about culture there, if those are the types of people that are getting into the leadership positions, that eventually shapes the culture and the trickle down effect that has on the business, right? In which case you're going in the opposite direction, and it's not about the buyer obsession. It's just about those old school traits that we talked about. So what would you suggest, because some businesses that's already happened, right? That the culture isn't quite right. And could you have any advice maybe for salespeople or maybe sales managers at that sort of mid-level management position where maybe the overarching culture is more about, look, we just need to drive the numbers. Is there something that they can be doing, or is it just a case of you need to find a better vehicle?
This is a tough question, Mark, because sales managers, just like any middle manager, is a highly pressured job because they're receiving pressure from 360 angle, right? From everyone, really. And it's a tough thing to do if you're a ambitious manager who is trying to do the right thing, but you're surrounded by pressure that's non-conducive. Hitting the numbers is not the end goal, right? It is a result of doing the right things. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I remember speaking to a business, an individual, and he was a mentor of mine. He was briefly a mentor of mine for about 7 months, maybe 8 months. He was worth about £200 million. He said that the goal for me was not to make the money. The goal for me was to understand my customers really well, create amazing products, deliver customer services that's better than everyone else out there, to create operations and supply chain situations, etc. He said my job was to do all those things to deliver the most amount of value to our customers, and in return we get the most amount of money back, right? So the end goal wasn't to make more money. It was a byproduct of doing all the right things. So I think that's probably the first thing that I would advise to sales managers, which is, if I want to really make this work and I want to be a great sales manager, what are the things that I need to do and I need to work with my team on in order for us to achieve that byproduct, right? But what are the things that are most important? And that's the first thing that I would probably recommend a sales manager asks, which is figure out what the anatomy of a great sales manager is. Is it the gift of the gab, really? No, it isn't, right? Because that's not going to serve me, because I'm speaking to customers, but I'm no longer that sharpest end, right? My team are. So how do I facilitate so that they win and in turn I win through that situation. So figure out what the anatomy of a great sales manager is. You'll find that it's not what you think, right? The skills that served you as a salesperson, a quota bearer, aren't the same skills that will serve you as a manager. And there's that regular or common saying that the best sales managers aren't necessarily the best salespeople. In fact, the best sales coaches and trainers aren't necessarily the best salespeople. I wasn't always the best salesperson in the business, right? There were people that were better than me at certain aspects of that. So figure out what makes you shine. You're going to have to set your ego aside, because for you to win, and I use that in inverted commas, your team has to win, right? And then by the principles of association, when your senior leaders see that your team are winning, they're going to naturally, hopefully, if they have the right culture and attitude, see that it's because of you, not necessarily because of something else. So you're going to have to set your ego aside as a sales manager. Now, in order to deal with the pressure from up above, that's a tough one. And it's hard to say in general terms, because it's based upon the sales leader that you report to, their background, their situation, the pressure they're under as well. What I would look at is always look to the perspective of from the buyer's situation. And one of the approaches would be to say, look, here's the direction that we're going on, and try to quantify that. And if we're going down that path, you think that we're going to have this result, but actually we're going to have this result. Or we're going down this path and we're going to achieve X, but actually if we took a different approach, we'd achieve Y, which is far higher. And here are the steps in which we can do that. And here is why it is a lower risk for you. Because one of the big things is, it's all about loss aversion, right? So Daniel Kahneman and Evan Tversky, when they wrote the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, one of the principles of the heuristics was loss aversion, and in terms of neuroscience and what I learned there, this holds true. People will spend more time avoiding a loss than you would gaining a reward, right? If you said to someone, you have to make a choice, there's 100% chance that you're going to lose £1,000. So would you choose to avoid that? Or there is a 95% chance of you attaining £10,000. So 100% chance that you're going to lose 1,000, and 95% chance that you're going to win £10,000. Now, believe it or not, most people actually move towards preventing the 100% chance loss of £1,000, even though they're given the option of 95% chance, which is really high, of attaining £10,000, which is 10 times that of the loss aversion. People will still move to loss aversion. So managing risk is a really big part of how we calculate things internally, right? And it's very emotional. So deal with the emotion. And that's the other final big thing that I would talk about, which is precious few people, not just salespeople, precious few people really understand both the emotions that people go through and how it factors into decision-making, and how do you actually apply principles that address the emotion and therefore reduce the emotional perception of risk. Because that you'll find is one of the biggest factors when it comes to someone's perception and decisions that they make. Perception isn't reality, it's emotion is reality, actually. So dealing with the emotional things that your leader is going through and managing those risks, managing those emotions in the right way, and almost saying, actually, the emotion you will feel if we took a different approach is far greater in terms of positive nature than the current emotion you'll feel if we just continue where we are. Dealing with that is another thing that you would look at. But this is a really big topic, Mark, and I'm trying to distill as much of the important things as I can, but there's a whole lot of information behind that. But does that make sense, what I've described? I think I've just splurged out a lot of stuff.
Amazing. This is a really dense episode, so I really do appreciate it. Dense in terms of value, I mean. So yeah, there was probably about 5 or 6 things that different directions we could go off of that. Do you think that We're talking about being aware of the emotional state or the loss aversion or whatever it is of the buyer, of the other person, of the
Mm,
different stakeholders we're talking to. I I get the sense that a lot of the time we're bound up in our own heads. We're concerned about, oh, what is this person thinking about me, or maybe
mm.
it's self-interest. We're thinking about the commission we're going to make on that deal or something like that. And it prevents us from getting outside of this and actually putting ourselves in the shoes of the buyer. Do you think that's quite common? Because I don't know. I feel like if we can approach with more of a curious mindset, an empathetic mindset, then it really does help to just get us out of our own heads. And yeah, you're nodding, so I think you pretty get what I'm saying.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
Curiosity. Oftentimes our worst enemy is ourselves.
yeah, yeah.
And I can go into the science behind it, but your mind is just this beautifully amazing organ, and we create our realities. There are over 7 billion people on this planet, and yet there are over 7 billion virtual realities of this world, right? Everyone is shaped by the experience, the memory, the knowledge that we have. And that is why no one person sees or experiences something exactly the same way as someone else.
Yeah.
And that's because, so 2 to 4 million bits per second is the amount of information that your sensory organs are able to sense, right? So 2 to 4 million bits per second. And yet your brain can only process 134 bits per second. So 2 to 4 million is coming in, and yet we can only process less than a tenth of that, less than even 0.1% of that, actually, 134 bits per second.
Yeah.
That means that your emotions, right, and your memory, right, form the biggest part of you translating what your senses are bringing in, what your senses are actually sensing from what's coming in around the world. That means that your mindset is everything. And so if you are nervous about a situation, if you are upset, if you are angry, right? Or if you're happy, if you're confident, if you're joyous, they have a huge outcome in terms of how you translate what's going on in the world around you. So one of the biggest things that I teach salespeople is it's great to understand the emotional perspective of the buyer. It's even more powerful to first understand your emotional state, and what you're thinking about that. And these are not new principles, but they are principles that are that require attention and time, and people have got to understand how important that is. Let's take an example of when you go into a negotiation situation. Your mindset and your ability to control your emotions is so important in a negotiation situation, because the tone of your voice, which is the expression of your emotions internally, the words that you use, how you say things, etc., your body language, can either make or break a negotiation, right? And it's the same for any sales interaction. And the thing that you want to do is, do you want to bring out the worst version of yourself in a sales conversation? Obviously not. Would you rather have the best version of yourself in every sales interaction? Absolutely. And so you are the person that can control whether the best version or the worst version of yourself turns up. And a lot of the times, it's not the lack of knowledge or skills or training. And I know this sounds weird coming from someone that has made a living from sales training, but it's not always a lack of those things. Most of the time, it's the lack of the right mindset, a lack of the right emotional state. I can throw as much sales skills and best practice onto you as much as possible, but if the soil, which is you, is not a fertile ground, then none of that will take root and spring and shine. So get the soil right first, right? Get the emotional state right first. And I published a post recently on negotiation. One of the biggest things that's missing in negotiation training is not the skills of negotiation. It's actually people's relationship with money. And most people have a very bad or disempowering relationship with money or perception of money. And deal with that, and you deal with probably more than 80% of the problem with how you approach a negotiation situation. So that's just an example of this. But that's a very, very long answer to your question, but it's a very big topic. Salespeople have to really get a hold of their emotions and understand it, right? This is not about controlling a wild horse. This is about flowing with the river of your emotions, stepping into that river, understanding its temperature, it's how strong the current is, how it's moving, and observing it. And by doing that, you're not trying to control something anymore that's going to break away from you. You're trying to understand something for you to be able to harness in the right way.
Nothing to add there. Actually, what I will say is I think I'd even go further than what you just said, because the 2 to 4 million bits per second, a lot of that is being processed subconsciously by the other person as well. So
yes, spot on.
You are a little bit off. If you're apprehensive, if your tonality or your body language is not quite right, or you're doing some shifty eye thing, people do pick up on that, even if it is subconsciously, right? And that can prevent you from being able to develop rapport and trust and things like that. But again, that's a whole other conversation.
No, that's a very powerful point. No, you just made a very powerful point, and thank you for doing so, because your body and your neural systems remember everything. Your unconscious mind remembers it all. But it won't, only 134 bits is consciously processed. You're absolutely right.
It's amazing. Great. No, thank you, Moeed. I really enjoyed this conversation. Could you just tell us where can people find you? Where can they connect with you?
Firstly, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. So linkedin.com/Moeed Amin. I'm regularly on there, always contributing, always responding to people's messages and requests for more information. You can also catch me on the website, www.proverbialdoor.com. We're just about to update the website as well, so it will have more clarity on what it is that we're doing. And you can also catch me on YouTube, Proverbial Door, as well. We've got a ton of videos, and there'll be more coming along in terms of free advice there. And we also have our own podcast, which is the Persuasion Lab podcast. Again, ton of free advice. But, firstly, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can certainly contact me there if you have any questions.
Great. I'll put all the links in the description for this as well, so people can find
you.
It. Brilliant. Okay. Thanks again, Moeed. Great to meet you. And let's do it again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed the conversation. Great question.